When I first moved into my house, I didn't think much of the Willow Creek Homeowners Association, HOA. It seemed like a good idea on paper, a group of neighbors working together to maintain the quality of the neighborhood. I was a 27-year-old professional, new to the area, and I was excited to plant roots. The house was perfect for me. It had that cozy, suburban charm I'd always dreamed about. The neighborhood was the kind that looked like it came from a picture-perfect suburban movie. Families going for walks in the evenings, kids riding their bikes in the cul-de-sac, and perfectly manicured lawns everywhere. It was everything I had hoped for. No noise, no drama, just peace and quiet. The HOA's presence was mostly invisible at first. Their welcome packet arrived in the mail just after I moved in. The rules seemed simple enough. Keep the lawn mowed, don't park on the street overnight, and don't let the house fall into disrepair. Who could argue with that? But after a week of living there, I started to notice the small things, the extremely particular rules. There were unwritten regulations, little things you couldn't put your finger on but still had to follow. I didn't mind at first. The rules felt like they were just there to help keep the neighborhood nice. But I had no idea that the HOA wasn't as harmless as it seemed. The first time I had a real encounter with the HOA was when I saw a man walking down the street with a clipboard in hand. He was tall, balding, and looked like someone who enjoyed enforcing rules just a little too much. He wasn't wearing a uniform or anything that marked him as part of the HOA, but his presence alone was enough to make my skin crawl. As he approached my house, I noticed he was staring at my front yard. It didn't take long before I figured out who he was. His name was Cliff Jenkins, and he was the president of the HOA. He didn't introduce himself at first, though. He just stood there for a moment, looking over my yard. "Nice place," he said in a way that felt more like an accusation than a compliment. "Thanks," I replied, unsure if I should feel flattered or uncomfortable. He shifted his gaze to the small set of garden gnomes I had placed near the edge of my flower bed. "You know," he continued, "those gnomes might not be in line with the community guidelines." I raised an eyebrow. "The gnomes?" I asked. "They're just a couple of garden gnomes." "Cute, right?" Cliff didn't smile. "The guidelines are clear. We don't allow any decorative items that could be seen as disruptive to the community's aesthetic." He gave me a hard stare. "Those gnomes might be seen as, let's say, childish." I didn't know whether to laugh or get angry. "Are you seriously telling me I can't have a couple of garden gnomes?" Cliff gave a slow nod. "It's in the rules. You'll receive a formal letter, and you'll have 7 days to remove them." I stood there stunned, trying to process what had just happened. This was the first real contact I'd had with the HOA, and I was already being told to get rid of something harmless, something I'd purchased for a few bucks at a local store. I wanted to argue, but Cliff was already turning and walking away. "You'll receive the letter shortly," he called over his shoulder. And just like that, the rules that I thought would help maintain order in the neighborhood started feeling less like suggestions and more like demands. The letter arrived 2 days later. It was formal, cold, and bureaucratic, nothing like the friendly, neighborly spirit I had imagined the HOA to embody. It laid out the rules about acceptable yard decor and made clear that failure to comply would result in a fine. In bold letters, it stated, "Failure to remove the gnomes within 7 days will result in a fine of $50, and continued non-compliance could result in further penalties, including the possibility of legal action." I couldn't believe it. A fine over gnomes. At that moment, I realized the HOA wasn't just a harmless group of neighbors. It was an authoritarian regime in disguise. And unfortunately, this was just the beginning. I was angry, but I didn't want to make waves. I thought maybe I could avoid any more problems by simply complying. So I took down the gnomes, but I knew, deep down, that this was only the start of something much bigger. What had I gotten myself into? Was this just a quirky HOA, or was it something more sinister? I had no idea, but I was about to find out. What I didn't know yet was that Cliff Jenkins had an agenda, and it went far beyond garden gnomes. It wasn't long after the gnome incident that the next letter arrived. This time, it wasn't about something as innocuous as garden decor, but rather a violation of a rule I hadn't even known existed. The letter stated that I had been non-compliant with the neighborhood's parking rules. I read the letter over and over, wondering if I was misinterpreting it. According to the HOA, I had left my car parked on the street overnight on a Tuesday. The thing was, I hadn't parked my car on the street. I parked it in my driveway. My driveway, which was more than wide enough for a single vehicle. But according to their rules, parking on the street was prohibited between 10 p.m. and 7 a.m., and apparently, my driveway wasn't wide enough to fit the approved number of cars. I was baffled. Are they serious? I muttered to myself, staring at the letter. How could this be a violation? The street was quiet, and my car had been parked in my driveway. What was the problem? After taking a few deep breaths, I called the HOA number listed on the letter. When the call connected, Cliff's voice answered right away, as though he had been waiting for it. He had a knack for making every conversation feel like a performance, a one-man show where he was the judge, jury, and executioner. "Cliff Jenkins here," he said, his voice clipped and businesslike. "How may I help you?" I didn't waste time with pleasantries. I received a letter about my car being parked overnight on the street, but I don't think that's what happened. I parked in my driveway, not on the street. There was a long pause before he replied. "Yes, well, the rule specifies that vehicles must not be left parked on the street, regardless of where they were parked the night before. Parking in your driveway, while technically allowed, is only permissible if the vehicle does not extend beyond the sidewalk. If it does, it's considered a violation." I felt my jaw clench. My car is parked within the lines of my driveway. It doesn't extend beyond the sidewalk. Cliff's tone grew colder. "I'm afraid I'm going to have to insist on compliance. The rules are clear. A violation is a violation, and you will be fined $25 for this incident." I took a deep breath, trying to keep my cool. "You're fining me for $25 for something that isn't even a violation." "Yes," he said, unyielding. "You've been warned, and if you don't comply, the fine will increase." My blood boiled. There was no explanation, no logic, just a demand to follow arbitrary rules. This wasn't about maintaining the neighborhood. It was about control. I was no longer dealing with a group of well-meaning neighbors. I was dealing with a petty tyrant. "Cliff, this is ridiculous," I shot back, trying to keep my voice steady. "You're fining me for something that isn't even a violation. This is harassment." He ignored my frustration. "It's for the betterment of the neighborhood," he replied, his tone dismissive. "If you'd like, you can appeal the fine at the next HOA meeting." I was about to argue more, but before I could, he added, "Good luck getting any support. People around here tend to follow the rules, not cause trouble." And with that, he hung up. I sat there, staring at the phone in disbelief. The audacity. He wasn't just enforcing rules. He was reveling in the power to control everyone's lives. He didn't care about fairness or reason. He cared about making sure every neighbor bent to his will. In the following days, I could feel the growing tension. I had been hit with a fine for something as absurd as parking in my driveway. If this was what I was going to face every time I stepped out of line, things were only going to escalate. And worst of all, Cliff's words echoed in my mind. People around here tend to follow the rules, not cause trouble. Was I the only one who thought this was outrageous, or had everyone else in the neighborhood simply accepted this kind of micromanaging as normal? It certainly felt like I was on my own, as though I was the only one who saw how unreasonable the HOA had become. I spent the next couple of days talking to a few neighbors, hoping for some solidarity, but I quickly realized something unsettling. They were all too afraid to speak out. Every conversation I had with them made it clear. They were too terrified of fines, reprimands, and possibly even losing their homes to do anything other than comply with the HOA's every whim. No one was willing to fight back. That's when I realized something. I was going to have to fight this battle alone. The HOA was going to keep pushing their rules, using fear and intimidation to control everyone. But I wasn't going to just roll over and accept it. I couldn't. I had to find a way to stand up to them. And I would. The question was, How? After the parking fine, I thought the worst had passed. But I quickly learned how wrong I was. The Willow Creek HOA wasn't interested in making compromises, and their need for control was far more insidious than I had initially realized. What I had thought was a small, isolated issue was, in reality, the tip of the iceberg. The first sign of the HOA ramping up their efforts came a few weeks later. I received another letter. This time, the violation wasn't about my parking, my lawn, or even my doormat. No, it was about my trash cans. According to the letter, I had violated HOA rules by leaving my trash bins out on the curb for more than 24 hours before pickup. The letter was signed by Cliff Jenkins with the usual cold and clinical language. I was floored. I had always followed the trash schedule, putting my bins out the night before pickup, as I had done in every neighborhood I had ever lived in. But this, apparently, was a violation. According to the HOA guidelines, trash bins should be brought back behind the fence no later than 6 p.m. on trash pickup day. I hadn't even realized I had left them out past the approved time. I immediately called the HOA office, hoping to get some clarity. When Cliff answered, he sounded almost smug. "You should be more careful about your waste management," he said, the edge in his voice unmistakable. "The community's appearance is important, and we need to ensure everyone follows the rules." I tried to stay calm. "Cliff, I understand keeping the neighborhood tidy, but this is getting ridiculous. The bins were out for maybe a few extra hours. I'm not causing a disruption. There are far bigger issues in this neighborhood than trash bins." Cliff didn't care. "It's the principle of the matter. The rule exists for a reason. I suggest you adhere to it, or we'll have to fine you." He paused. "And if it continues, we could take further action. You've already received multiple warnings." I felt the blood rush to my face, but I kept my voice steady. "This is absurd. If you want to maintain a perfect neighborhood, go ahead, but at least make it fair. I'm not going to follow these petty rules just because you say so." Cliff's tone grew even colder. "You better start following them. If you don't, we'll be forced to escalate things further. It's not my fault if you don't want to comply." I ended the call, furious. I had spent hours reading over the HOA's rules and bylaws, and I was starting to see a pattern. Every issue that had been raised had been about the smallest details. The HOA was slowly becoming a micromanaging monster, nitpicking everything from the placement of my trash bins to the color of my fence. Every time I thought it couldn't get worse, it did. But now it was clear to me. This was a battle I couldn't win by simply complying. I needed to find a way to fight back. I wasn't alone, though. A couple of days later, I had a conversation with my neighbor, Rachel, who lived 2 doors down. She had been around much longer than I had and had dealt with the HOA for years. "Don't let them push you around," she said. "They've been getting worse. I've had my own issues with them. Fines for leaving my garden tools out for an hour too long. A complaint about the color of my shutters. It's a nightmare." Her words sent a chill down my spine. "They fined you for leaving tools out. For an hour?" Rachel nodded. "Yes, they said it was an eyesore. And don't get me started on the fines they slap on you for even the smallest things. A lot of us just comply because we don't have the energy to fight them. But it's all getting out of hand." She leaned closer, lowering her voice. "The worst part is that no one wants to stand up to them. People are terrified of what'll happen if they do. I heard they've even threatened foreclosure on a few people who weren't able to pay their fines." My stomach churned. Foreclosure? For parking violations? For leaving a trash bin out too long? I couldn't let this continue. The more I spoke to Rachel and other neighbors, the more I realized that I wasn't the only one who had been unfairly targeted. Everyone was afraid to speak up because of the retaliation they might face. The HOA had built a culture of fear, and yet, despite their tactics, I could see a glimmer of something more powerful: discontent. There was a growing frustration among the residents. But as Rachel pointed out, no one was willing to stand up against Cliff Jenkins and the rest of the HOA board. Everyone had simply accepted the status quo, fearing that if they challenged the HOA, it would only make things worse. I felt a spark of resolve. If no one else would fight, then I had to. It wasn't just about me anymore. It was about all the people who had been bullied into silence. It was about the future of this community. As much as I hated to admit it, I knew there was only one way to fight back. I had to expose the HOA for what it really was. But how could I do that without the HOA retaliating? That was the question that would consume my every thought in the coming days. And it wasn't just about exposing them. It was about ensuring that no one else would ever have to endure what I had. Things escalated even further in the weeks following my conversation with Rachel. The HOA had made it clear that they would not tolerate even the slightest deviation from their rules. It wasn't just about enforcing guidelines anymore. It was about control. I began to feel like a prisoner in my own home. Each day, I feared receiving another letter, another fine, or another call from Cliff, who seemed to delight in making my life more difficult. But the final straw came one fateful Saturday morning. I had parked my car in my driveway again, just like I always did. I was getting ready to leave for the grocery store when I noticed a tow truck idling in front of my house. The driver, a large man in a reflective vest, was standing next to my car, looking at the vehicle with a clipboard in hand. I froze. What was happening? I rushed out of the house, my heart pounding. "Hey, what are you doing?" I called out, my voice shaking with a mix of confusion and anger. The tow truck driver didn't answer at first, but his gaze flicked over to Cliff Jenkins, who was standing at the end of my driveway, arms crossed and watching the situation unfold like a silent judge. "Cliff, what is this?" I demanded, my voice rising. Cliff took his time before speaking, clearly enjoying the power he held. "You've been warned multiple times," he said coolly. "Your car is parked in violation of HOA regulations. It's sticking out of the driveway, and that's against the rules." I glanced at my car. It was parked neatly within the lines of my driveway. It was nowhere near the sidewalk. It wasn't sticking out at all. It was absurd. But I could see in Cliff's eyes that he wasn't going to back down. I turned to the tow truck driver, who was now making his way to my car. "Wait," I shouted, rushing to stand in front of my vehicle. "You can't tow my car. It's not violating anything. I'm following the rules." Cliff stepped forward, his face stone cold. "You've been warned. You've had your chance." His voice was low, almost mocking. "Either you move it, or the car will be towed." I felt a surge of panic, the reality of what was happening sinking in. They were actually going to tow my car over a false violation. I could feel the pressure mounting on me, the weight of the absurdity of the situation threatening to crush me. "No," I said, my voice growing steadier. "This is it. I've had enough. You can't do this to me." Cliff raised an eyebrow, clearly unbothered by my defiance. "Oh, I can, and I will. You refused to comply with the rules, and now you'll face the consequences. I suggest you get used to it." I was furious. I was powerless. Or at least I thought I was. The humiliation of having my car towed over something so trivial was too much. I felt a deep sense of helplessness, and yet something inside me snapped. This wasn't just about my car. This was about a system that had gotten so out of control that it was willing to crush anyone who dared to challenge it. I knew at that moment that I could no longer sit back and accept this. I couldn't just let Cliff and the HOA walk all over me, and I certainly couldn't let them make an example out of me to intimidate others into silence. "Stop," I shouted at the tow truck driver, stepping in front of the car. "I'm calling the police. You can't tow my car without reason." Cliff's face twisted with annoyance. "You'll regret this," he warned, stepping closer. "You've already ignored multiple warnings. Now you're deliberately obstructing the towing process. You could face legal consequences for that." I felt a twinge of fear at his words, but I wasn't going to back down. I grabbed my phone, dialing the non-emergency police number. "I need help. They're trying to tow my car without cause," I told the dispatcher. Cliff sneered, clearly irritated by my refusal to bow down. He turned on his heel and started walking toward the tow truck, mumbling something under his breath about how this would only make things worse for me. Within minutes, the police arrived, much to Cliff's apparent frustration. The officer who came to the scene was calm and professional, listening to my side of the story and then speaking with Cliff. After a few heated exchanges, the officer turned to me. "Ma'am, it seems that this is more of a misunderstanding than anything else," the officer said, his tone sympathetic. "The car's placement is fine. There's no violation here. You're free to go." I was in shock. It wasn't even a matter of proving the rules. I had been right all along, and the officer confirmed it. Cliff had no grounds to tow my car. The officer turned to Cliff and gave him a stern look. "This has gone too far. If you keep trying to escalate things like this, you'll have bigger problems. This isn't how an HOA should operate." Cliff was fuming, but he didn't say a word. The tow truck driver reluctantly started up his truck and drove off, leaving Cliff standing there, red-faced and humiliated. I stood tall, trying to calm my shaking hands. This was it. This was my breaking point, and it was going to be the HOA's too. I was done being intimidated. No more fines. No more threats. It was time to fight back. And this time, I wasn't going to let them win. The tow truck incident had rattled me more than I expected. The reality of just how far the HOA was willing to go in their quest for control hit me hard, but it also ignited something inside of me. I wasn't going to just roll over anymore. They had pushed me too far, and now I was going to push back. I spent the next few days carefully considering my options. I knew that challenging the HOA wasn't going to be easy. After all, they had the power to impose fines, issue threats, and as I had now seen firsthand, even intimidate residents into submission. But I wasn't going to let them use that power to steamroll me. I needed to find a way to expose them for what they truly were. A corrupt, overbearing organization that had outlived its purpose. The first thing I did was dive into the HOA's governing documents. I spent hours poring over their rules, their bylaws, and their meeting minutes. I knew there had to be something there, something I could use against them. The more I read, the more I saw the cracks in their structure. The rules they imposed were not only unreasonable, they were selectively enforced. I wasn't the only one who had been targeted by the HOA. It was clear that many residents had been quietly suffering under their thumb. But what struck me most was the fact that the HOA board members, particularly Cliff Jenkins, had been repeatedly making decisions that were not in line with the official rules. There were inconsistencies in how fines were issued, how certain complaints were handled, and even questionable expenditures listed in the financial statements. It was all right there, on paper, waiting to be discovered. That was when the idea hit me. I had to go public. I reached out to Rachel first. If there was one thing I had learned from our earlier conversation, it was that she wasn't the only neighbor fed up with the HOA. Rachel had always been an outspoken person, but even she had been reluctant to challenge the system. After a long chat, though, she was on board. Together, we decided to start gathering support from other residents. We needed to show the HOA that they couldn't intimidate everyone into silence. Over the next few weeks, I began gathering a small group of neighbors who were willing to speak out. Some were reluctant at first, but once they saw that others were on board, they started to feel braver. We held a few covert meetings, discussing everything from how the HOA had unfairly targeted certain individuals to how the board was possibly misusing funds. As the group grew, so did our resolve. We weren't just going to fight for ourselves. We were going to fight for everyone who had been bullied into submission. But we didn't stop there. I wanted to make sure that HOA knew we meant business. One evening, I filed a formal complaint with the state's Department of Consumer Affairs, detailing the HOA's illegal and unethical practices. I outlined everything from selective enforcement of rules to possible violations of state law regarding fair housing and discrimination. I also made contact with a local investigative reporter who had covered HOA abuses in the past. She was interested in the story, and I knew that if we could get the media involved, the HOA would be forced to answer for their actions. It was risky, but I knew it was the right move. The public exposure would be the pressure they needed to back down. Meanwhile, I had my own personal vendetta to settle with Cliff Jenkins. He'd crossed a line when he threatened to tow my car for no reason, and I wasn't about to let him get away with it. I went through the recordings I had of his phone calls and interactions with me, and I started gathering witnesses. neighbors who had also felt the sting of his unreasonable behavior. I knew the HOA president was corrupt, but now I had the ammunition to prove it. The more I dug into Cliff's dealings, the more I uncovered. There were whispers of board members who had been pressured into agreeing with Cliff's decisions. I discovered that Cliff had been using his position to enrich himself, charging excessive fees for maintenance projects that were either never completed or poorly done. And worst of all, I found evidence that he had personally benefited from some of the HOA's questionable contracts. As the pieces of the puzzle came together, I felt a surge of adrenaline. This wasn't just about gnomes and parking violations anymore. This was about holding people like Cliff Jenkins accountable. It was about stopping the HOA from bullying good people out of their homes and ruining the lives of those who dared to question them. I had a strategy now. We had a strategy. The next HOA meeting was coming up, and it was the perfect opportunity to put everything we had into motion. Armed with all the evidence we had gathered, I felt confident we could finally expose the truth. It was time for the HOA to face the consequences of their actions. But little did I know, Cliff wasn't going to go down without a fight, and as I prepared to bring the truth to light, I had no idea just how far he was willing to go to protect his reign. The showdown was inevitable, and it was going to be brutal. The day of the HOA meeting arrived, and the atmosphere in Willow Creek was thick with anticipation. As I prepared to attend, I could feel the weight of everything that had led to this point. The evidence was in my hands. The support from my neighbors had solidified. The media was on standby. Now, all we had to do was present the truth and let the chips fall where they may. I arrived early to the meeting, knowing that Cliff and the other board members would be ready to defend their actions. I could already hear the murmurs of tension from the other residents as they trickled into the community center where the meeting was being held. Most of them were quiet, unsure of how this would unfold, but there were a few who gave me silent nods of solidarity. They understood that this wasn't just about me anymore. It was about taking down a system that had been abusing its power for far too long. When the meeting began, Cliff stood at the front, his usual smug expression plastered across his face. He greeted everyone with his standard condescending tone, as if he were doing us all a favor by even acknowledging our existence. The board members sat behind him, silent but watchful, their eyes darting nervously around the room. I had seen them all before, their tight-lipped expressions and forced smiles. They were there to uphold Cliff's reign, no matter the cost. "Let's get this meeting started," Cliff said, his voice carrying the same arrogant authority it always did. "We have several important matters to discuss today, but first, let me remind you all of the importance of adhering to our community rules. A well-maintained neighborhood is a happy neighborhood, and I expect everyone to follow the guidelines set forth by the board." I could feel my blood boiling at his words, but I stayed silent, my hands clenched tightly in my lap. He wasn't going to get away with this. Not anymore. After a few routine items were addressed, Cliff called for a vote on a new rule to restrict outdoor decorations even further, banning any kind of seasonal decorations that could be deemed unsightly. The crowd murmured in disbelief at the suggestion, but before anyone could voice their opposition, I stood up, my heart pounding in my chest. "I have something to say," I declared, my voice firm but calm. All eyes turned toward me. Cliff's expression faltered for just a moment, but he quickly regained his composure. "What is it, Ms. Carter? This is not the time for personal grievances." I didn't back down. "Actually, Cliff, I believe this is exactly the time for personal grievances. You see, I've been living in this neighborhood for over a year now, and I've seen firsthand how your HOA is out of control. You've made life miserable for me and for many others, with your arbitrary fines and unreasonable rules. But what's worse is that I've uncovered evidence of your abuse of power." Gasps rippled through the room. I could see some of my neighbors leaning forward, eager to hear what I had to say. Cliff's face turned a shade of red I hadn't seen before. "You're accusing me of abuse of power," he sneered, his voice growing more defensive. "What proof do you have, Ms. Carter? Do you have anything substantial to back up your baseless claims?" I smiled, knowing that this was the moment of reckoning. I pulled out a thick folder filled with documents, contracts, and emails, everything I had painstakingly gathered over the past few weeks. I laid it on the table for all to see, making sure everyone in the room could see the evidence of corruption. "I have more than enough proof," I said. "I have documents showing that you, Cliff Jenkins, have personally benefited from HOA contracts. You've used your position to enrich yourself, charging the community for subpar work, and you've threatened residents who dared to question your authority. I've also spoken to several people who were afraid to come forward, but they're here now. They're ready to testify about the way you've manipulated the rules to punish anyone who doesn't bow down to you." The room went silent. The board members exchanged nervous glances, and even Cliff looked momentarily taken aback. For the first time, I saw a crack in his armor. "Are you seriously going to bring this nonsense into this meeting?" Cliff snapped, trying to regain control of the situation. But it was too late. Rachel, my neighbor, stood up from the back of the room, her voice steady and strong. "I've been threatened with fines for minor infractions that don't even exist," she said, her eyes locking with Cliff's. "I've been harassed for the color of my shutters, the placement of my garden tools, and even the timing of when I put out my trash cans. And I'm not the only one. We're all tired of living in fear." More neighbors stood up, one by one, recounting their own stories of unjust fines, harassment, and intimidation. The momentum was building, and I could feel the power of the collective will shifting in our favor. Cliff's bravado was quickly evaporating as the room filled with voices demanding accountability. "You can't intimidate us anymore," I said, my voice ringing out over the growing murmurs of support. "You may have controlled this neighborhood with fear for years, but not anymore. We're done." Cliff stood there, his face pale and his jaw clenched, unable to muster a response. He had lost control, and he knew it. The HOA board members were silent, realizing they had been exposed. This was no longer a meeting about neighborhood rules. It was about power, corruption, and the end of an era. With the support of my neighbors, the motion to remove Cliff from his position as HOA president was swiftly put to a vote. There was no contest. The majority voted in favor, and for the first time in Willow Creek's history, the board had lost its stranglehold over the community. As the meeting ended, I felt a rush of triumph. The HOA's reign of terror was over. But I knew that the battle wasn't truly over yet. Cliff and his cohorts weren't going down without a fight. However, the damage had been done. The truth had been exposed, and the wheels of change were in motion. And Cliff Jenkins, well, I had no doubt that this would be the last time anyone in Willow Creek would be afraid of him. The HOA was done, and we had won. The aftermath of the HOA meeting was a whirlwind. What had begun as a quiet revolt against the tyrannical rule of Cliff Jenkins and his board had suddenly exploded into something much bigger. The news had gotten wind of what had happened, and before I knew it, local reporters were calling me for interviews. The story of an overbearing HOA president exploiting his power had struck a chord, and the community was buzzing with the news of our victory. Cliff, for all his bluster, was on the defensive now. After losing the vote to remove him as president, he spent the next few days trying to salvage his position, but it was clear that his time in power was over. The support he had once commanded from the board began to erode as other members started turning on him. The pressure was too much, and rumors began swirling that some of his fellow board members had even begun to gather evidence against him. It was like watching a sinking ship, except this ship was made of greed and corruption, and it was going down fast. But Cliff wasn't going to give up without a fight. Late one evening, I received a call that made my stomach drop. It was from Rachel. "Lena, you need to get to the community center. The HOA is trying to hold an emergency meeting," she said, her voice tense. "They're trying to take control back. They're bringing in lawyers. I think they're going to try and force us to reverse the vote." I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. I knew they wouldn't just roll over, but I hadn't expected them to try something so brazen. If they succeeded in this emergency meeting, everything we'd fought for could be undone. The thought of Cliff worming his way back into power made my blood boil. I immediately gathered a few of the most vocal residents and rushed to the community center. When we arrived, the building was already filling up with disgruntled residents. Some looked confused, Others were angry, and a few were outright frightened, clearly worried that the HOA would pull some legal trickery to reverse the changes we'd fought so hard for. I could hear hushed conversations around me, people unsure whether to trust the HOA or continue to stand with us. Inside the center, Cliff was there, standing with his usual smug expression, flanked by two well-dressed lawyers. The board members were sitting in their usual seats, looking uncomfortably out of place, their faces lined with tension. The room quieted as I walked in, and for a moment, all eyes were on me. "We'd have called this meeting in response to the vote last week," Cliff announced, his voice dripping with venom. "It was an illegal vote, one that was improperly executed and based on lies. We are taking legal action to reverse the decision and restore order to this community." I stood up, the anger inside me surging once again. "That vote wasn't illegal, Cliff. You're just scared because the truth is finally coming to light. We exposed you for what you are. A power-hungry bully who's been exploiting this community for years. We're not backing down. You're not going to intimidate us into silence anymore." The room erupted into murmurs. Some people clapped. Others shouted their agreement. It was clear that the tide had shifted. Cliff's grip on the room was slipping, and he could feel it. Cliff's lawyer, a tall man with sharp features, stood up, waving a piece of paper in the air. "The bylaws were not properly followed when the vote was taken," he argued. "We intend to file a lawsuit and have the vote declared invalid. The community's interests are at risk. If the actions of this rogue group are allowed to stand, it will lead to chaos in Willow Creek." But the more they spoke, the more the crowd seemed to turn against them. The truth was already out there. Cliff had lost his moral high ground. It was no longer just a matter of rules. It was a matter of justice. People weren't afraid of his threats anymore. They were empowered by the knowledge that they weren't alone. I stood up again, holding my ground. "You can't bully us anymore, Cliff," I said, my voice firm and resolute. "You can try to use legal threats, but we've already won. We have the support of the community, the media, and most importantly, we have the truth. Your days of manipulating this HOA are over." And that's when it happened. A handful of board members, those who had once stood with Cliff, began to stand up, one by one, and publicly disavow him. They shared their own stories of how they had been pressured into siding with him, how they had witnessed his abuses firsthand but had been too afraid to speak out. With each confession, Cliff's face grew darker. Finally, one of the longtime members, a woman named Susan, stood and addressed the room. "I've been a part of this HOA for over a decade," she said, her voice shaking with emotion, "and I've seen things I can't ignore anymore. I was complicit in what was happening. I am sorry to all of you, and I stand with Lena and the rest of the residents. We need change. It's time for a new era in Willow Creek." That was the turning point. The room erupted into applause. The tide had fully turned against Cliff. He was now completely isolated, with no allies left to support him. Even his own lawyers were starting to distance themselves from the situation, realizing that the battle was lost. The emergency meeting collapsed in chaos, with the residents voicing their support for a new board and demanding that Cliff be removed from the HOA entirely. As the meeting was adjourned, I saw Cliff standing there, looking utterly defeated, his face a mask of fury and helplessness. The very thing he had fought so hard to control was slipping through his fingers. As I walked out of the community center, I felt an overwhelming sense of accomplishment. Cliff Jenkins and his corrupt board had finally been exposed. The residents of Willow Creek had reclaimed their power. But even in that moment of triumph, I knew this was only the beginning. The HOA was finished, and we were ready to rebuild. The weeks following the collapse of Cliff Jenkins' reign were a blur of change and rebuilding. The victory we had fought so hard for was no longer just an idea. It was a reality. The HOA was officially dissolved, and a new, fairer system was being put into place. But as satisfying as it was to watch Cliff's empire crumble, the work was far from over. Willow Creek had to heal, and the scars left by years of intimidation and corruption were deep. At first, things were chaotic. There were meetings with the city council to establish a new, resident-driven leadership for the community. We had to decide what our new HOA, if we even wanted one, should look like. Should we maintain a governing body to handle neighborhood issues, or should we leave everything to a collective, democratic process? The whole community was involved in the discussions, which was a far cry from the closed-door meetings of the old HOA board. Rachel and I found ourselves at the forefront of this effort. Neither of us had ever imagined we'd be in such a position, but after everything that had transpired, we were both determined to make sure the new leadership would be transparent, fair, and open to input from every single resident. We didn't want to recreate the same power structure that had caused so much damage. We wanted something better. It wasn't easy, though. There were still those who didn't trust the process, who feared that the pendulum would swing too far in the other direction. Some of the older residents, who had long been loyal to Cliff out of fear or habit, were hesitant to embrace the changes. They still remembered the old days when a single phone call from the HOA president could bring the whole neighborhood to heel. But those who had suffered under Cliff's rule were more than ready to rebuild, and it was clear that the overwhelming majority of Willow Creek was ready to move on and ensure that no one, especially not someone like Cliff, could ever take control again. Slowly but surely, we created a new board made up of community members who had a genuine interest in preserving the neighborhood's integrity without resorting to fear and intimidation. Then came the legal fallout. Cliff, of course, wasn't going down without a fight. He filed lawsuits against several of the residents, accusing us of slander, defamation, and wrongful removal from the HOA. But as the weeks went by, it became more and more clear that his case was weak. His corrupt practices had been well documented, and even the lawyers he had hired were starting to distance themselves from him. In a final act of desperation, Cliff tried to rally support by claiming that the new HOA was an illegal entity, accusing us of violating the community's original covenant. But that argument didn't hold up in court. The residents of Willow Creek had spoken with a united voice, and the judge ruled in our favor. Cliff's attempts to reclaim power had failed spectacularly, and his financial situation, already strained from his failed legal battles, only worsened. The man who had once ruled over us with an iron fist now found himself scrambling to salvage whatever was left of his reputation. But that wasn't the only consequence. As part of the settlement, Cliff was banned from participating in any future HOA activities in Willow Creek. He was also ordered to pay restitution to several residents who had been financially harmed by his actions, though I doubted he'd ever be able to repay them fully. As for the rest of the board members who had been complicit, many of them either resigned or were voted out in the new elections. Some of them, like Susan, found redemption by acknowledging their wrongdoings, and the community slowly forgave them. For me, the battle wasn't just about winning against Cliff. It was about something bigger, reclaiming my community. Willow Creek had been a place of quiet suburban life, but it had become something else under the control of the HOA, a place where fear ruled and the voices of its residents were silenced. Now it was a place of hope, a place where people spoke up for what was right, where we trusted each other, and where everyone had a say in how our neighborhood would be run. The media buzzed about the story for a while, as such an intense power struggle wasn't something you saw every day. But as time passed, the headlines faded. The real change was happening quietly in the homes and hearts of the residents who had fought so hard to reclaim their lives. Willow Creek wasn't just a neighborhood anymore. It was a symbol of resilience, of the strength of a community that refused to be broken. And then there was the personal side of it all. My relationship with my father, the mayor, had changed too. He'd been proud of me, but I could tell it had been difficult for him to watch his daughter take on such a powerful entity. In the end, though, he respected my decision. It hadn't been easy, but he knew that I had done what was right for the community and for myself. He even mentioned, half jokingly, that maybe he'd start paying more attention to local politics in the future, though I doubted he'd ever run for office again. But I knew that no matter what came next, I had already won. I'd taken on the corrupt system, and with the support of my neighbors, I brought it down. It was more than just a victory over an HOA president. It was a triumph over fear and intimidation. The future of Willow Creek was in our hands now, and as I looked around at the faces of my neighbors, those who had stood with me through the hardest times, I knew that we had built something lasting. The HOA had threatened to arrest me. They had underestimated me, underestimated all of us. But in the end, it was the HOA that had been arrested, not by the police, but by the people who refused to let them control us anymore. And as for me, I was finally free.